The day Father Michael O'Brien became the most hated man in social justice circles was the same day he exposed the difference between fighting for justice and fighting for attention. They made a critical mistake when they decided to block a funeral procession, his funeral procession. St. Catherine's Parish sits like a weathered anchor in the heart of Portland's rapidly changing Pearl District, its red brick walls and modest spire standing defiantly against the glass towers and trendy restaurants that have sprouted around it like digital age weeds. Father Michael O'Brien has watched this transformation for 18 years, serving as pastor while his neighborhood evolved from working-class families who packed the Sunday pews to tech workers who barely acknowledged the church's existence. At 52, Michael carries himself with the quiet confidence of someone who's seen enough human nature to surprise him anymore. His Irish brogue, softened by decades in America but never quite erased, becomes more pronounced when he's passionate about something, which happens often in a neighborhood where gentrification pushes out long-time residents faster than he can organize community meetings to address it. Michael inherited more than just his accent from the old country. His father, Sean O'Brien, spent 40 years organizing dock workers in Boston before moving the family west in search of steadier work and cleaner air. His mother, Mary, worked as a nurse at Portland General Hospital until arthritis forced her retirement. Both parents instilled in their son a belief that faith without action is meaningless, and that true service happens in the trenches of daily life rather than the spotlight of public attention. The church reflects this philosophy. St. Catherine's runs a soup kitchen that serves 300 meals every Tuesday and Thursday. The basement houses citizenship classes for immigrants navigating America's bureaucratic maze. The community center hosts job training programs, addiction recovery meetings, and, yes, activist gatherings for various causes, including the Portland Justice Coalition. The coalition represents everything that frustrates Michael about modern activism. Led by Emma Martinez, a 24-year-old Columbia graduate student pursuing a master's degree in social justice studies, and Dylan Reed, a 26-year-old trust fund activist whose family's timber fortune funds his revolutionary cosplay. The group has transformed from 12 committed organizers into a social media phenomenon with over 300 followers. Michael doesn't oppose their cause. Affordable housing is a legitimate crisis in Portland, and police accountability matters deeply to communities he serves. What bothers him is their methods. Every protest seems designed more for Instagram than impact. Every demonstration calculated for viral potential rather than meaningful change. They've turned activism into performance art, complete with carefully curated aesthetics and hashtag campaigns that generate more heat than light. The coalition uses St. Catherine's Community Center twice a month for their meetings, a privilege Michael extends to all community groups regardless of their politics. Emma and Dylan always arrive with their laptops and ring lights, live streaming their planning sessions as if the mundane work of organizing deserves the same attention as the protests themselves. They charge their followers $50 per month for organizational support, while using the church's space for free, a detail that hasn't escaped Michael's notice. The breaking point comes when Catherine Walsh dies peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in March. At 89, Catherine had cleaned St. Catherine's for 40 years, arriving every weekday at 6 a.m. to vacuum the pews, polish the altar, and ensure everything was perfect for the day's services. Parishioners knew her as the tiny Irish woman with steel-gray hair and hands that never stopped moving, but few understood the full scope of her quiet revolution. Catherine Walsh was more than a church cleaner. In 1963, she marched with Dr. King in Washington, her young face determined and hopeful in photographs that would later hang in the church's community center. She spent decades helping immigrant families navigate citizenship applications, never charging a fee and often paying filing costs from her own modest savings. She quietly funded college educations for dozens of neighborhood kids whose families couldn't afford tuition, asking only that they someday help someone else. When Catherine's funeral is scheduled for Saturday morning, Michael expects a modest service followed by a procession to St. Mary's Cemetery, where she'll be buried beside her husband Patrick, who died 5 years earlier. The route requires traveling down Morrison Street, the same street where the Portland Justice Coalition has decided to stage their biggest protest yet. Michael learns about the conflict 3 days before the funeral when Emma Martinez mentions it casually during a coalition meeting. "We'll have Morrison Street completely blocked," she says, reviewing her protest checklist. "The city approved our permit for the entire day. No traffic, no distractions, just pure focus on housing justice." Michael approaches her after the meeting, his concern evident. "Emma, we have a funeral procession scheduled for Saturday. Mrs. Walsh needs to get to St. Mary's Cemetery, and Morrison Street is the only route." Emma's response reveals everything wrong with performative activism. "Father, I understand your concern," she says with practiced condescension, "but our fight for housing justice affects hundreds of families. We can't reschedule a major action because of one person's convenience." Dylan nods enthusiastically, his camera still recording. "Besides, death is part of life. Mrs. Walsh would probably want us to keep fighting for the living." Neither Emma nor Dylan has ever met Catherine Walsh. They've used the church's community center for months without bothering to learn about the woman who kept it clean. To them, she's just an obstacle to their media moment, a scheduling conflict to be dismissed rather than a human being deserving of dignity. That night, Michael sits in the empty church, looking at Catherine's photograph on his desk. The image shows her in 1963, arm in arm with other civil rights marchers, her face radiating the kind of quiet determination that changes the world without needing recognition. Below it, a more recent photo shows her teaching citizenship classes in the church basement, her aged hands steady as she helps someone fill out paperwork. The activists want to fight for justice while dishonoring someone who actually lived it. They're about to learn that Father Michael O'Brien inherited more than just his father's accent. He inherited his strategic mind and his understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with megaphones and hashtags, but with patience, preparation, and the moral authority that comes from actually serving the people you claim to represent. Emma Martinez arrived in Portland 2 years ago with a Columbia University master's degree in social justice studies, a trust fund that covers her rent, and a burning desire to change the world. The problem is, she's never experienced the world she wants to change. Her parents are successful immigration lawyers in Santa Barbara who sent her to private schools and paid for her Ivy League education. Her activism is fueled by academic theory rather than lived experience, making her passionate but dangerously naive about the communities she claims to serve. Emma's apartment in the Pearl District costs more per month than most of her coalition followers earn, but she's justified the expense as necessary for her work. "I need to be where the action is," she explains to followers who question her lifestyle choices. Revolution requires sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice is living in the heart of gentrification to fight it from within. Her social media presence reflects this disconnect. Instagram photos show her at protests with perfectly applied makeup and carefully curated outfits that look revolutionary but cost more than minimum wage workers earn in a week. Her Twitter feed mixes genuine outrage about housing inequality with pictures of her artisanal coffee and expensive organic meals. She charges her followers $50 per month for organizational support, while using St. Catherine's Community Center for free, a detail that hasn't escaped the notice of more observant community members. Dylan Reed represents an even more frustrating strain of modern activism. His trust fund, generated by his grandfather's timber empire, allows him to treat social justice as a hobby rather than a necessity. The irony is breathtaking. He's using money from environmental destruction to fund environmental activism, using profits from exploiting workers to fight for workers' rights. His family's timber company clear-cut thousands of acres of old-growth forests that environmental groups now desperately try to protect. Dylan's activism is performative in the most literal sense. He live streams everything, treating protests like reality TV shows designed for viral consumption. His followers tune in not for educational content, but for entertainment, watching him confront authority figures and deliver impassioned speeches that sound revolutionary but accomplish nothing concrete. He's built a personal brand around being a social justice warrior, complete with merchandise and Patreon subscriptions that fund his comfortable lifestyle. The Portland Justice Coalition started with legitimate goals. Housing affordability is a real crisis in Portland, where tech worker salaries have driven rents beyond the reach of longtime residents. Police accountability matters deeply to communities that have experienced discrimination and violence. Environmental protection is crucial for a city that prides itself on sustainability. These issues deserve serious attention and organized response. But under Emma and Dylan's leadership, the coalition has become more interested in attention than action. Their protests are designed for social media impact rather than policy change. They measure success in followers gained rather than families helped. They've attracted hundreds of supporters, mostly young professionals who treat activism like a social activity, attending protests the way previous generations attended parties. The coalition's latest target is Heritage Heights, a proposed luxury apartment complex that would demolish several low-income buildings to make room for high-end units. The development represents everything wrong with Portland's housing crisis, displacing working families to create homes for wealthy newcomers. Fighting the project is both morally justified and strategically sound, which makes the coalition's approach even more frustrating. Instead of organizing tenants, researching alternatives, or building coalitions with established housing advocates, Emma and Dylan have decided to stage a massive street protest designed to raise awareness about the issue. They've obtained permits to block Morrison Street for an entire Saturday, creating what they promise will be their biggest demonstration yet. The protest planning reveals the coalition's fundamental problem. Emma and Dylan spend more time discussing camera angles and hashtag strategies than they do studying the actual housing proposal. They've invited influencers and lifestyle bloggers to attend, treating the demonstration like a content creation opportunity. Their promotional materials emphasize the visual impact of the protest rather than the policy changes they want to achieve. When Father Michael approaches them about the funeral procession, their response exposes the moral bankruptcy of performative activism. Emma doesn't see Catherine Walsh as a human being deserving of dignity. She sees her as a scheduling conflict that threatens to interfere with their media moment. Dylan's suggestion that death is part of life reveals someone who's never experienced real loss or understood the importance of ritual and respect in processing grief. Neither Emma nor Dylan has bothered to learn about the communities they claim to represent. They've used St. Catherine's Community Center for months without meeting the woman who kept it clean. They've organized housing protests without talking to the families facing eviction. They've built a following by performing activism rather than practicing it. The coalition's membership reflects this disconnect. Most followers are young professionals who can afford to attend weekend protests because they're not working multiple jobs or caring for elderly parents. They're people who can get arrested for civil disobedience without worrying about losing their employment or facing immigration consequences. They're activists who can afford to be activists, treating social justice like a hobby rather than a necessity. Emma's academic background makes her particularly dangerous because she's intelligent enough to rationalize her selfishness with theoretical frameworks. She talks about systemic oppression and revolutionary praxis while exploiting her followers financially and using community resources without giving back. Her Columbia education provided her with the vocabulary to sound righteous while acting selfishly. Dylan's trust fund background makes him even more problematic because he's using his family's wealth to purchase moral authority he hasn't earned. He positions himself as a champion of the working class while living off money extracted from environmental destruction and labor exploitation. His activism is essentially a form of virtue, signaling designed to assuage his guilt about his privilege rather than actually sharing that privilege with others. The coalition's approach to the funeral situation reveals everything wrong with modern performative activism. They're more concerned with their image than their impact, more interested in being seen as revolutionary than in actually helping people. They've turned Catherine Walsh's death into a test of their commitment to the cause, when it should be a moment to reflect on what real activism looks like. Father Michael understands what they don't. that Catherine Walsh represents the kind of activism that actually changes lives, the quiet work of helping people navigate systems and overcome barriers, the daily practice of service without recognition or reward. Father Michael spends the evening after his conversation with the activists sitting in the empty church, surrounded by the quiet presence of worn wooden pews and flickering votive candles. The silence feels heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge that Catherine Walsh will never again arrive at dawn to begin her daily routine of cleaning and preparing the sanctuary for worship. Catherine's photograph sits on his desk, next to the funeral program he's been preparing. The image shows her in 1963, arm in arm with other civil rights marchers, her young face radiating the kind of quiet determination that changes the world without needing recognition. Her eyes in that old photograph hold the same steady resolve he saw every morning when she arrived for work, the same unshakable commitment to doing what needed to be done regardless of who was watching. Michael's phone buzzes with notifications from the coalition's social media accounts. Emma has posted another update about their Justice for Housing demonstration, complete with revolutionary hashtags and calls to action. The post includes a professionally designed graphic announcing the complete closure of Morrison Street and promises of direct action that will force the city to confront the housing crisis. Notably absent from the promotional material is any mention of the funeral procession they'll be blocking or the community members whose lives they'll be disrupting. The disconnect between the coalition's online presence and their actual impact frustrates Michael more than their politics. He's worked with genuine housing advocates for years, people who spend their time helping families navigate rental assistance programs, organizing tenant unions, and building coalitions with established civil rights organizations. These activists measure success in families housed, not followers gained. That night, Michael calls his sister Sarah in Chicago. She inherited their father's strategic mind along with his commitment to organized labor, working as a labor lawyer who specializes in union organizing. Sarah understands the difference between effective activism and performative protest better than anyone. Mickey, she says, using the childhood nickname that only family members are allowed to use. These trust fund revolutionaries are everywhere now. They've turned activism into a lifestyle brand. Dad would have eaten them alive. Sean O'Brien organized dock workers for 40 years, facing down corporate executives, corrupt union officials, and violent strikebreakers. He understood that real change required patience, strategy, and the moral authority that comes from actually serving the people you claim to represent. He also taught his children that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with picket signs and slogans, but with careful preparation and the strategic use of information. Sarah helps Michael research the coalition's leadership, their funding sources, and their previous demonstrations. What they discover is both predictable and damning. Emma Martinez's academic thesis was titled Performance and Authenticity in Modern Social Justice Movements, revealing her awareness of the very problem she embodies. Dylan Reed's trust fund comes from Reed Timber Corporation, the same company that destroyed thousands of acres of old-growth forests that environmental groups now desperately try to protect. The financial trail reveals even more troubling details. The coalition charges members $50 per month for organizational support, while using St. Catherine's Community Center for free. Emma's personal expenses, her Pearl District apartment, her organic food deliveries, her designer activism wardrobe, are all funded by these membership fees. Dylan's lifestyle, funded by his trust fund, includes 3 properties in Portland, 2 of which he's converted to expensive short-term rentals that contribute to the housing crisis he claims to oppose. Michael also discovers that the coalition has been systematically taking credit for the work of established housing advocates. Their social media posts feature photos from tenant organizing meetings they didn't attend, quote statistics from reports they didn't write, and claim victories achieved by organizations they've never supported. They've built their reputation by appropriating the work of people who actually help families in need. The priest begins formulating a plan that would make his father proud. Sean O'Brien always said that the best way to defeat bullies was to expose their true character to the people they claim to serve. The coalition's leadership has built their authority on lies and performance. Michael's job is to reveal the truth and let the community draw its own conclusions. He starts by reaching out to the organizations that actually do housing advocacy work in Portland. The Portland Tenants Union, the Fair Housing Council, the Legal Aid Society, all groups that have been quietly helping families for decades without seeking media attention. These organizations know Catherine Walsh's work because she supported them financially and volunteered her time when they needed help. Michael also contacts the religious leaders who've worked with Catherine over the years. Rabbi Sarah Gold from Temple Beth, Israel, remembers Catherine helping Jewish refugee families navigate the immigration system. Imam Hassan al-Rashid from the Islamic Community Center recalls her quiet donations to help Muslim families facing discrimination. Reverend Marcus Williams from the Historic Baptist Church tells stories of Catherine's work during the Civil Rights Movement, her willingness to risk arrest for justice while never seeking recognition for her courage. The interfaith coalition that Catherine helped build over decades represents the kind of authentic community organizing that the Justice Coalition claims to practice but has never understood. These religious leaders work with immigrants, advocate for affordable housing, and fight for social justice through daily service rather than weekend protests. Michael's plan begins to take shape. He'll use Catherine's funeral to demonstrate the difference between authentic activism and performative protest. He'll show the community who Catherine really was and what she accomplished through quiet service. He'll expose the coalition's leadership for what they really are, privileged young people who've turned other people's suffering into content for their social media accounts. The funeral procession will become a teaching moment about the difference between fighting for justice and fighting for attention. Catherine Walsh spent her life serving others without recognition. Her death will become a lesson in authentic activism for anyone willing to learn. Saturday morning arrives with a kind of gray Portland drizzle that seems to seep into everything, turning the city's colors muted and soft. The weather mirrors the somber mood gathering at St. Catherine's as mourners begin arriving for Catherine Walsh's funeral. Cars park along the narrow streets surrounding the church, their occupants hurrying through the light rain with black umbrellas and quiet conversations. Father Michael stands at the church entrance, greeting each arrival with personal recognition that speaks to his 18 years of service in this community. These aren't the polished professionals who populate most Portland events. They're the working families, elderly immigrants, and longtime residents who represent the city's authentic soul rather than its gentrified facade. Elena Vasquez arrives with her grandson, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, both dressed in their finest clothes to honor the woman who changed their family's trajectory. Elena's English remains limited after 40 years in Portland, but her weathered hands grip a rosary, and her eyes hold the deep gratitude of someone who understands debt that can never be repaid. Miguel wears his medical coat over his suit, having left the hospital briefly to attend a funeral before returning to his Saturday shift. Tom Washington enters with the careful dignity of a man who's carried the weight of history on his shoulders. At 70, his face shows the lines of someone who lived through the civil rights movement and understands the difference between real sacrifice and performative activism. He carries a manila folder containing photographs and documents from his civil rights work with Catherine in the 1960s, memories he plans to share during the service. The church fills with an unusual cross-section of Portland's population. Union representatives from the docks, the hotels, and the public schools occupy pews alongside immigrants from Mexico, Somalia, and Eastern Europe. Former homeless individuals who credit Catherine with helping them find housing sit next to retired teachers who remember her volunteering in their classrooms. City council members who knew her advocacy work share space with teenagers whose college educations she quietly funded. Notably absent from the congregation are the activists who've been using the church's facilities for months. Emma Martinez, Dylan Reed, and their followers are preparing for their street protest, apparently unaware that they're missing the funeral of someone who accomplished more for social justice than they ever will. Father Michael delivers a eulogy that serves as both tribute and teaching moment. He speaks of Catherine's life in concrete terms that contrast sharply with the abstract rhetoric of modern activism. Her civil rights work wasn't about hashtags or viral videos. It was about risking arrest to integrate lunch counters and register voters. Her immigration advocacy wasn't about social media posts. It was about spending her Saturdays helping families navigate citizenship applications and paying legal fees from her own limited income. Catherine Walsh never held a press conference. Michael tells the packed church, his Irish accent thickening with emotion. She never had a Twitter account. She never live-streamed her activism or asked for donations to support her work. She simply saw people in need and helped them day after day, year after year, without recognition or reward. The priest's words carry weight because everyone in the congregation has personal experience with Catherine's service. Elena remembers Catherine helping her fill out citizenship paperwork at the kitchen table, patiently explaining each section while teaching her English words she'd need for the citizenship test. Tom recalls Catherine bringing sandwiches to protesters in jail, using her own money to pay their bail, never asking for reimbursement or recognition. Dr. Vasquez speaks during the service, his voice breaking as he describes how Catherine's scholarship fund allowed him to attend medical school. She never asked for anything in return, he says, looking at his grandmother in the front pew. She just said, "Someday you'll help someone else." That's how she thought about everything. Not what she could get, but what she could give. The service concludes with the preparation for the funeral procession to St. Mary's Cemetery, where Catherine will be buried beside her husband Patrick. The route requires traveling down Morrison Street, the same street where the Portland Justice Coalition has constructed their protest infrastructure. As the mourners file out of the church, Father Michael notices something remarkable happening. The funeral has drawn representatives from every legitimate social justice organization in Portland. Not the performative activists who show up for photo opportunities, but the people who actually do the work of community organizing, legal advocacy, and direct service. Maria Santos from the Hotel Workers Union stands with her members, all of whom remember Catherine's support during their last contract negotiation. She brought coffee and donuts to the picket line and helped organize community support for their cause. Rosa Delgado from the Immigrant Rights Coalition carries a banner reading, "Thank you, Catherine," in Spanish and English, representing the hundreds of families Catherine helped over the decades. The funeral procession that forms outside St. Catherine's represents authentic community organizing rather than performative activism. These are people who knew Catherine personally, who experienced her service directly, who understand the difference between talking about justice and living it. Father Michael realizes that Catherine's death has accomplished something remarkable. It's brought together the real activists, the people who spend their time helping others rather than building their personal brands. The procession includes union members, immigrant advocates, civil rights veterans, and religious leaders who've spent decades working for social justice without needing recognition or social media followers. As the funeral procession prepares to leave for St. Mary's Cemetery, Michael knows they're about to encounter the coalition's protest. The contrast will be stark, genuine community members honoring someone who actually changed lives, versus privileged activists staging a performance for their social media accounts. The rain continues to fall softly as the procession begins its journey toward Morrison Street, where Catherine Walsh's final lesson in authentic activism is about to begin. Morrison Street has been transformed into a carnival of modern activism, complete with all the theatrical elements that define performative protest. Colorful banners stretch between lampposts, declaring housing is a human right and gentrification kills communities, in professionally printed fonts that cost more than most of the coalition's supposed beneficiaries earn in a week. A makeshift stage constructed from milk crates and plywood occupies the intersection's center, flanked by speakers that pump out revolutionary music between speeches. Emma Martinez stands on the platform like a general surveying her troops, her designer activism outfit carefully chosen to photograph while appearing authentically revolutionary. Her megaphone bears stickers from various causes: environmental justice, police accountability, immigrant rights, creating a visual resume of her performative activism. She addresses the crowd with the practiced cadence of someone who spent more time studying social justice than practicing it. "Today we make history," she declares, her voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. "Today we tell the developers and the politicians that our communities are not for sale. Today we show them that when they try to destroy affordable housing, we will stand in their way. The crowd responds with enthusiastic cheering, but it's the kind of enthusiasm that comes from people treating activism like entertainment rather than necessity. Most of the protesters are young professionals who can afford to spend their Saturdays at demonstrations because they're not working multiple jobs or caring for elderly parents. They hold professionally printed signs while wearing expensive outdoor gear. Their activism accessories costing more than many Portland residents spend on groceries. Dylan Reed live streams the entire event on Instagram, providing running commentary about revolutionary action and disrupting the system for his followers. His camera captures the colorful spectacle but misses the deeper reality that this protest is designed more for viral content than policy change. His followers respond with fire emojis and heart symbols, treating the demonstration like a reality show rather than a serious political action. The coalition has transformed Morrison Street into their vision of what activism should look like: visually impressive, socially media-friendly, and completely disconnected from the communities they claim to serve. They've created a protest that looks revolutionary but accomplishes nothing beyond generating content for their social media accounts. Neither Emma nor Dylan notices the funeral procession approaching until Father Michael's voice cuts through their amplified rhetoric. The priest stands at the intersection's edge, flanked by the long line of vehicles that make up Catherine Walsh's final journey. His presence immediately changes the atmosphere, introducing a gravity that the theatrical protest cannot match. "Excuse me," Michael says, his Irish accent thickening with controlled emotion. "We need to pass through. We're burying a woman who spent her life fighting for the same things you claim to care about." Emma turns from her platform, visibly annoyed at the interruption to her performance. Her expression shows the irritation of someone who's been interrupted during an important speech, not the concern of someone who's just learned about a conflict with a funeral procession. "Father, we explained this to you earlier," she says, her voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone who believes she's teaching a lesson to someone less enlightened. "Our demonstration has a legal permit. We can't just stop our housing justice work because of scheduling conflicts." Dylan approaches with his camera still rolling, sensing an opportunity for dramatic content. His Instagram followers love confrontation, and this unexpected conflict with a funeral procession could generate significant engagement. He positions himself to capture both the protesters and the mourners, treating the moment like a documentary filmmaker rather than someone who's actively creating the conflict he's recording. "Father, surely you understand that our fight for housing justice affects hundreds of families right now," Dylan says, his camera capturing his own words for his social media audience. "We can't prioritize the dead over the living. These families need homes today, not tomorrow." The callousness of his statement shocks even some of his own followers. The Instagram comments begin filling with viewers who realize they're watching activists block a funeral procession, not just another housing demonstration. The optics are terrible, but Dylan is too focused on creating content to recognize the damage he's causing to his own cause. Father Michael's response reveals the careful preparation that went into this moment. He produces a folder containing documentation of Catherine Walsh's life and work, her biography serving as a stark contrast to the coalition's performative activism. This woman, Michael says, his voice carrying down the block street, marched with Dr. King in 1963. She spent 40 years helping immigrant families navigate the citizenship process. She quietly funded college educations for dozens of neighborhood kids whose families couldn't afford tuition. She did more for social justice in 1 year than your coalition has accomplished in its entire existence. The crowd of protesters begins to murmur as they realize the magnitude of what they're blocking. These aren't just any mourners. They're burying someone who actually lived the values the coalition claims to represent. The contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Genuine activists who spent their lives serving others versus privileged young people who've turned activism into a personal brand. Emma's response reveals the fundamental problem with academic activism. "Father, while we appreciate Mrs. Walsh's individual contributions, We have to focus on systemic change. She says her social justice education providing her with language that sounds righteous while justifying cruelty. One person's funeral can't stop our fight for housing justice that affects thousands of families. Her words expose the moral bankruptcy of performative activism, the willingness to sacrifice human dignity for abstract principles, to dishonor someone who actually changed lives in service of a cause that exists more in hashtags than in reality. The confrontation has begun, but Father Michael knows this is just the opening move in a larger game. The coalition's leadership has revealed their true character, and now the real community, the people who actually do the work of social justice, will have their say. As Father Michael finishes reading Catherine Walsh's biography, the composition of the crowd around Morrison Street begins to shift dramatically. The union members who came to honor Catherine step forward from the funeral procession, and their presence immediately changes the dynamic of the confrontation. These aren't college students playing at Revolution or trust fund activists treating social justice like a hobby. These are working people who've spent decades in actual struggles for workers' rights, civil rights, and economic justice. Maria Santos, president of the Hotel Workers Union, approaches Emma Martinez with a measured stride of someone who's organized real strikes, negotiated actual contracts, and faced down corporate executives trying to break union organizing efforts. Her calloused hands and weathered face tell the story of someone who's worked in hotels for 30 years, cleaning rooms and fighting for healthcare benefits and living wages. Mija, Maria says, her voice carrying the authority of someone who's led thousands of workers through contract negotiations. You're blocking the funeral of a woman who helped my family get citizenship papers 20 years ago. She didn't charge us a fee. She didn't ask for recognition. She didn't post about it on social media. She just helped because it was right. Emma's response reveals the fundamental disconnect between academic activism and lived experience. I understand your emotional attachment, she says, her social justice education providing her with clinical language that sounds compassionate while remaining detached, but we have to think systematically about housing justice. Individual cases can't distract us from structural change. Tom Washington, a 70-year-old black man who worked alongside Catherine in the 1960s civil rights movement, shakes his head in disgust. His presence commands immediate respect from everyone who understands Portland's history. He was there when the city's black community faced redlining, urban renewal, and systematic discrimination. He marched with Catherine, was arrested with her, and witnessed her quiet courage during the movement's most dangerous moments. You'll talk about justice like it's some academic concept, Tom says, his voice carrying the weight of someone who's seen real oppression and fought against it. Catherine Walsh bailed protesters out of jail during Freedom Summer. She fed striking workers from her own kitchen. She put her body on the line when it actually mattered. And now you won't let her get to her grave in peace. The tension escalates as more community members arrive from the funeral procession. These aren't the gentrifying tech workers who usually populate Portland protests. These are the people the activists claim to represent but have never actually met. Immigrant families whose children Catherine helped through citizenship classes. Elderly union members who remember her from picket lines in the 1970s and 1980s. Former homeless individuals who credit her with helping them find housing and employment. Dylan Reed continues filming, but his Instagram commentary becomes increasingly defensive as he realizes his audience is watching him block a funeral procession. The comments on his live stream shift from supportive fire emojis to criticism and disgust as viewers learn more about Catherine Walsh's history and the coalition's callous response to her death. Wait, they're blocking a funeral? One commenter writes. That's literally someone's grandmother they're dishonoring. This is disgusting, another adds. These aren't real activists, they're just narcissists with cameras. Emma Martinez finds herself facing Rosa Delgado, an 82-year-old Mexican immigrant who speaks English with a heavy accent, but whose words carry more moral authority than any academic thesis. Rosa's weathered hands grip Emma's shoulders with surprising strength, forcing the young activist to look into eyes that have seen real hardship and genuine service. You want to fight for justice? Rosa asks, her voice steady despite her age. then you honor the people who fought before you. Catherine Walsh, she didn't need to help us. She was Irish, we were Mexican, but she saw us as human beings, not as causes to advance her career. Rosa's words cut through Emma's theoretical framework like a blade. This isn't abstract intersectionality or allyship from a textbook. This is the lived experience of someone who received help from Catherine Walsh and understood the difference between genuine service and performative activism. The coalition's followers begin to waver as they realize they're on the wrong side of this confrontation. Some quietly slip away, unwilling to be associated with blocking a funeral. Others remain, but their enthusiasm has clearly diminished, replaced by uncomfortable recognition that they're preventing the burial of someone who actually accomplished the things they only talk about. Dr. Miguel Vasquez, Elena's grandson whose medical education Catherine funded, approaches the group with the quiet dignity of someone who understands debt that can never be repaid. His presence in his medical coat adds another layer of credibility to the mourners' cause. Here's someone whose life was directly changed by Catherine's generosity, who now saves lives because she invested in his education. My grandmother came to this country with nothing, he says, gesturing to Elena who stands nearby, clutching her rosary. Catherine Walsh helped her learn English, helped her navigate the citizenship process, helped her find work. She never asked for anything in return. She just said, "Someday you'll help someone else." The contrast becomes impossible to ignore. On one side, privileged activists who charge their followers monthly fees while using the church's facilities for free. On the other, working families whose lives were directly improved by Catherine Walsh's quiet service. The difference between talking about justice and living it becomes stark and undeniable. Father Michael watches the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. He didn't need to destroy the coalition's credibility. They're doing it themselves through their inability to recognize the moral weight of their actions. The community members surrounding them aren't abstract beneficiaries of social justice work. They're real people with real stories of Catherine's impact on their lives. The confrontation has moved beyond a simple scheduling conflict. It's become a referendum on the nature of activism itself, a choice between genuine service and performative protest, between helping people and helping yourself to recognition and praise. The confrontation between the funeral procession and the protesters attracts Portland's media attention, but not the kind Emma Martinez and Dylan Reed had hoped for when they planned their demonstration. Local news crews arrive expecting to cover a routine housing protest, only to discover a group of young activists blocking the funeral of a civil rights hero. The optics are disastrous, and the coalition's leadership seems oblivious to the damage they're causing to their own cause. Channel 8's veteran reporter Janet Kim has covered Portland's activist scene for 15 years, and she immediately recognizes the public relations catastrophe unfolding before her cameras. Her news crew captures the stark contrast between the dignified mourners honoring Catherine Walsh and the increasingly defensive activists refusing to allow the funeral procession to pass. This is Janet Kim reporting from Morrison Street. She says into her microphone, her professional demeanor unable to hide her incredulity at the situation, where a planned housing protest has collided with the funeral procession for Catherine Walsh, a longtime civil rights activist and community volunteer. The Portland Justice Coalition is refusing to allow the funeral procession to pass through their demonstration, creating a standoff that's drawing sharp criticism from community leaders and civil rights veterans. Dylan Reed approaches the news crew with his camera still rolling, hoping to control the narrative and explain the coalition's position to a broader audience. His trust fund background becomes immediately apparent in his speech patterns and mannerisms, his privileged accent jarring against the working-class voices of the mourners around him. "We're fighting for housing justice," Dylan says, his words sounding rehearsed and hollow against the backdrop of genuine grief. "One person's funeral can't stop our fight for people who need homes right now. We have to prioritize the living over the dead." The camera captures the immediate reaction of the mourners, particularly Rosa Delgado's disgusted expression and Tom Washington's slow, disbelieving head shake. These images will play on Portland's news stations for days, becoming visual shorthand for the coalition's moral bankruptcy. Janet Kim's follow-up question exposes the activists' fundamental disconnect from the community they claim to serve. Mr. Reed, were you aware that Mrs. Walsh spent decades fighting for affordable housing and immigrant rights? Dylan's pause before answering reveals everything viewers need to know about the coalition's preparation and community knowledge. We don't research every individual in the community, he says, his defensive tone making the situation worse. Our focus is on systemic issues, not individual cases. The response demonstrates the coalition's approach to activism. They're fighting for abstract concepts rather than actual people, advancing theoretical frameworks rather than helping families in need. Their ignorance of Catherine Walsh's work exposes them as outsiders who've imposed their agenda on a community they don't understand. Father Michael grants an interview that becomes a masterclass in moral authority and community leadership. Standing beside the hearse containing Catherine Walsh's remains, he speaks with the calm confidence of someone who's spent decades actually serving the people the coalition claims to represent. Catherine Walsh spent 60 years fighting for social justice. Michael says, his Irish accent lending weight to his words. She marched with Dr. King when it was dangerous to do so. She helped hundreds of families navigate the immigration system. She quietly funded college educations for kids who couldn't afford them. And these young people, who claim to fight for justice, won't let her rest in peace beside her husband. The contrast between Father Michael's concrete examples of Catherine's service and the coalition's abstract rhetoric becomes impossible to ignore. The priest speaks of specific families helped, particular injustices addressed, real lives changed. The activists speak of systems and structures, hashtags and movements, but they can't name a single person they've actually helped. Emma Martinez attempts her own interview, but her academic language sounds increasingly hollow against the backdrop of Catherine's concrete achievements. We understand the emotional impact of this situation, she says, her social justice education providing her with clinical language that sounds compassionate while remaining detached, but we have to prioritize systematic change over individual sentiment. Our housing crisis affects thousands of families right now. Janet Kim's response cuts to the heart of the matter. Mississippi Martinez, Mrs. Walsh spent decades fighting for affordable housing. How does blocking her funeral advance that cause? Emma's response reveals the performative nature of the coalition's activism. Sometimes revolutionary action requires difficult choices, she says, falling back on theoretical frameworks when confronted with practical questions. We can't let emotional manipulation distract us from structural change. The phrase, emotional manipulation, in reference to a funeral procession shocks viewers and provides opponents with a soundbite that will haunt the coalition for months. Social media explodes with criticism as the interview clips circulate online, generating far more negative attention than the housing protest ever could have achieved positive coverage. Meanwhile, social media begins turning decisively against the coalition as the story spreads beyond Portland's local news coverage. The hashtag #LetHerRest begins trending locally, with users sharing stories of Catherine Walsh's kindness and questioning the activist priorities. Dylan's own Instagram followers begin criticizing him in the comments of his live stream, with many expressing disgust at his willingness to block a funeral. "This is sick," one follower writes. "You're literally preventing an old lady from being buried. How is this justice? I followed you because I thought you cared about people," another adds. "This shows you only care about yourself." The media attention has backfired spectacularly. Instead of highlighting their housing justice message, the coalition finds itself defending the decision to block a funeral. The story becomes about their callousness rather than their cause, their selfishness rather than their service. Father Michael's strategic patience is beginning to pay dividends. He didn't need to attack the coalition directly. Their own actions and words have exposed their true character to the community they claim to serve. The media coverage has amplified their moral failure, turning what should have been a routine housing protest into a lesson about the difference between authentic activism and performative protest. The confrontation has moved beyond Morrison Street to the court of public opinion. where the coalition's leadership is rapidly losing credibility with the very people they need to support their cause. As word of the blocked funeral spreads through Portland's neighborhoods via social media and local news coverage, the response is swift and overwhelmingly critical. The coalition's social media accounts are flooded with angry comments, not from conservative opponents trying to undermine progressive causes, but from the very communities they claim to represent. The backlash comes from immigrants, union members, civil rights veterans, and working families who understand the difference between authentic activism and performative protest. The immigrant rights organization that Catherine Walsh supported for decades issues a statement that appears on every major Portland news outlet within hours of the confrontation. Catherine Walsh was a champion for immigrant families long before it was fashionable. Their statement reads, "She helped hundreds of families navigate the citizenship process, often paying legal fees from her own pocket. She deserves the dignity of a peaceful funeral." The Justice Coalition's actions today dishonor her memory and betray the values she fought for. Similar statements pour in from labor unions whose members remember Catherine's support during contract negotiations and strikes. The Service Employees International Union, representing thousands of Portland workers, releases a particularly pointed rebuke. Catherine Walsh fed striking workers from her own kitchen and helped organize community support for our causes. She understood that solidarity means supporting each other in times of need, not blocking funerals for media attention. The Portland chapter of the NAACP, which Catherine supported throughout her life, issues a statement that cuts to the heart of the matter. Blocking the funeral of a civil rights veteran is not activism. It's cruelty dressed up as justice. Catherine Walsh marched with Dr. King, was arrested for registering voters, and spent decades fighting for equality. She earned the right to rest in peace. Local businesses begin closing in solidarity with the funeral procession, their owners expressing disgust at the coalition's actions. O'Malley's Irish Pub, where Catherine's wake was held, puts up a sign reading "Closed to honor Catherine Walsh, a real fighter for justice." The gesture spreads quickly through the neighborhood, with restaurants, shops, and service businesses shutting down to show respect for Catherine's memory and protest the coalition's callousness. Most damaging to the coalition is the response from Portland's established activist organizations, the groups that actually do the work of social justice rather than just talking about it. The Portland Tenants Union, which Catherine supported financially for years, condemns the protest in language that exposes the coalition's fundamental misunderstanding of community organizing. Real housing advocacy means building relationships with the families we serve, their statement reads. It means understanding that the people we fight for are human beings with lives, histories, and dignity. Catherine Walsh understood this. She spent decades helping families, not using them as props for media attention. The Legal Aid Society, where Catherine volunteered for 30 years, issues an even sharper rebuke. Catherine Walsh helped more families avoid homelessness than the Justice Coalition has ever contacted. She did this work quietly, without recognition, because she understood that activism is about serving others, not building your own profile. Dr. James Peterson, a professor of sociology at Portland State University and a veteran of the civil rights movement, arrives at Morrison Street and delivers an impromptu lecture that several bystanders record and share online. His words go viral within hours, becoming a defining moment in the confrontation. "You want to know what real activism looks like?" he says, pointing to the funeral procession. "It looks like Catherine Walsh spending her Saturdays teaching citizenship classes. It looks like her paying legal fees for immigrants facing deportation. It looks like her quietly funding scholarships for kids who couldn't afford college. It looks like 40 years of service without recognition." He turns to address Emma Martinez directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who lived through the movements the coalition claims to represent. "You've turned activism into performance art. You've made it about yourselves instead of the people you claim to help." Catherine Walsh never needed a megaphone or a hashtag because her actions spoke louder than any words. The criticism extends beyond Portland's activist community to the coalition's own funding sources. Investigative journalists begin examining Dylan Reed's background, uncovering the bitter irony of his family's wealth. His grandfather's timber company, Reed Forest Products, destroyed thousands of acres of old-growth forest that environmental groups now fight desperately to protect. The company's history of clear-cutting and environmental destruction becomes a major story, with reporters tracing the direct connection between the family's environmental crimes and Dylan's environmental activism. Trust fund environmentalist uses logging money to fund tree-hugging protests, reads one headline that captures the absurdity of Dylan's position. The story reveals that Dylan receives $15,000 per month from a trust fund built on environmental destruction, money he uses to fund protests against the very industries that created his wealth. Emma Martinez faces her own scrutiny as reporters examine her academic background and funding sources. Her Columbia University advisor, Dr. Sarah Chun, distances herself from Emma's actions in a statement that appears in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Ms. Martinez's behavior demonstrates exactly the kind of performative activism that academic institutions should discourage. She's treating real people's lives as material for her theoretical frameworks. The university itself faces pressure from donors and alumni who are horrified by the association with blocking a funeral. Emma's thesis advisor calls her directly, concerned about the negative publicity affecting the university's reputation and the social justice studies program. Emma, you need to understand what you've done, Dr. Chen explains during a tense phone conversation. You've blocked the funeral of a civil rights hero. This isn't advancing social justice. It's undermining everything the field stands for. The university is receiving hundreds of angry calls from alumni and donors. The coalition supporters begin deserting en masse as the full scope of their leaders' poor judgment becomes clear. The young professionals who attend protests as social events want nothing to do with blocking a funeral. Even the coalition's most devoted followers start questioning leadership that would prevent an elderly woman's burial for a photo opportunity. Portland's faith community rallies around Father Michael and Catherine's memory, with religious leaders from across the city issuing a joint statement condemning the coalition's actions. The interfaith alliance that Catherine helped build over decades, including Jewish, Muslim, and Protestant leaders, speaks with one voice about the importance of respecting the dead and honoring those who serve their communities. As the standoff enters its second hour, the coalition's position becomes increasingly untenable with each passing minute. What began as a demonstration with hundreds of supporters has dwindled to perhaps 30 diehard activists, mostly the core leadership and their most devoted followers. The broader community of protesters who initially supported the housing cause has melted away, unwilling to be associated with blocking a funeral procession. Emma Martinez and Dylan Reed find themselves isolated in the center of Morrison Street, surrounded by hostile community members whose stories of Catherine Walsh's service have transformed the narrative from housing protest to moral reckoning. The activists who remain are mostly those too committed to their ideological positions to acknowledge the catastrophic error in judgment they've made. The breaking point comes when Mrs. Elena Vasquez, the 78-year-old woman whose grandson Catherine helped put through medical school, approaches Emma directly. Elena's limited English carries devastating moral clarity as she speaks with the authority of someone who knows the difference between real help and performative activism. "You know, understand," Elena says, her weathered hands gripping Emma's shoulders with surprising strength. "Catherine, she say my family. My grandson, he doctor now because Catherine help him. She no ask for nothing. She just help because she good person." Elena's eyes fill with tears as she continues, her voice breaking with emotion. "You young, you think you know everything. But Catherine, she teaches what real help look like. Not with big words, not with signs. With heart, with action. You block her funeral, you spit on her memory." Dylan attempts to film the exchange for his Instagram audience, but Dr. Miguel Vasquez intervenes with quiet authority. "Put the camera away," he says firmly, his medical coat lending weight to his words. "This isn't content for your social media. This is my grandmother honoring a woman who changed our family's life." The confrontation escalates when some of the coalition's remaining supporters begin arguing with the mourners, their academic understanding of social justice colliding with the lived experience of Catherine's service. Brad Stevens, a 23-year-old recent college graduate who joined the coalition after reading about revolutionary theory, begins lecturing Tom Washington about prioritizing the living over the dead. Tom's response is swift and devastating, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who's lived through actual oppression and fought against it. "Son, I was getting beaten by police for voting rights before you were born. I spent 3 days in jail with Catherine Walsh in 1963 because we believe black folks deserved basic human dignity. Don't you dare lecture me about priorities." The generational divide becomes starkly apparent and morally decisive. The older activists who lived through the civil rights movement and witnessed Catherine's service are appalled by the coalition's actions. The younger members who learned about activism from textbooks and social media seem unable to grasp the moral dimensions of their choice to block a funeral. Emma Martinez faces her own moment of reckoning when confronted by Sarah Campbell, a social worker who has spent 20 years helping homeless families find housing. Sarah's critique cuts to the heart of the coalition's fundamental problem with performative activism. "I've been doing housing advocacy for 2 decades, Sarah says, her voice calm, but her words devastating. Catherine Walsh referred families to me for years. She'd call quietly, never asking for recognition, just wanting to help. She'd often pay their security deposits herself. You've been in Portland for 2 years, and you've never contacted our organization, never referred a single family for services, never donated money or time to actual housing programs." Sarah's indictment exposes the coalition's approach to activism. They're fighting for abstract concepts rather than helping actual people. "You're not housing advocates," she continues. "You're activists who've chosen housing as your cause because it sounds good on social media. Catherine Walsh was a housing advocate. She helped families. You help yourselves." Father Michael realizes that the coalition's leadership has painted themselves into a corner through their own arrogance and inflexibility. They've made the protest about their personal credibility rather than the housing issues they claim to care about. Backing down now would mean admitting they made a catastrophic error in judgment, but continuing means defending the indefensible. The moral pressure becomes overwhelming as local clergy from other churches begin arriving to support Father Michael. Rabbi Sarah Gold from Temple Beth Israel, Imam Hassan al-Rashid from the Islamic Community Center, and Reverend Marcus Williams from Astoria Baptist Church all stand together, representing the interfaith coalition that Catherine Walsh helped build over decades of community service. "Catherine Walsh served all of our communities," Rabbi Gold says, addressing the remaining protesters. "She helped Jewish refugee families, Muslim immigrants, Christian families, and secular families who needed assistance. She didn't ask about religion or politics. She just helped people because it was right." The religious leader's presence adds another layer of moral authority to the funeral procession. These aren't just angry mourners. They're the spiritual leaders of Portland's diverse communities, all united in their respect for Catherine Walsh and their disgust at the coalition's actions. Emma Martinez makes a desperate attempt to reframe the confrontation in ideological terms rather than personal ones. "This is exactly what the establishment wants," she says through her megaphone, her voice cracking with emotion and exhaustion. "They want to divide us by making us choose between honoring the dead and fighting for the living. We can't let emotional manipulation stop us from pursuing justice." Her words fall flat against the weight of concrete testimony about Catherine's service. The mourners surrounding her aren't representatives of the establishment. They're working families, immigrants, union members, and community volunteers who benefited directly from Catherine's help. Dylan Reed makes his own last stand, doubling down on his position with the stubborn certainty of someone who's never been held accountable for his actions. "We can't let individual tragedy distract us from systemic oppression," he says, his camera still rolling. Catherine Walsh is dead. She doesn't need justice anymore. The living do. The cruelty of his words shocks even his most devoted followers. Several people audibly gasp, and the remaining coalition supporters begin backing away from their leadership, finally understanding the moral bankruptcy of their position. Father Michael decides it's time to reveal the full extent of his preparation for this confrontation. The coalition's leadership has exposed their true character through their own words and actions, but the priest has spent the week building a comprehensive case that will leave no doubt about the difference between authentic activism and performative protest. From his jacket pocket, he produces a folder containing financial records, academic documents, and social media posts that paint a damning picture of the coalition's disconnect from the communities they claim to serve. The documents represent hours of research conducted with the help of his sister Sarah and other allies who understand the importance of preparation in confronting bullies. You want to talk about housing justice? Father Michael asks, his voice carrying across the block street to the remaining protesters and the growing crowd of onlookers. Let's talk about the fact that Dylan Reed owns 3 properties in Portland, including 2 that he's converted to expensive short-term rentals, directly contributing to the housing crisis he claims to oppose. The revelation sends shockwaves through the remaining coalition supporters. Dylan's face turns crimson as he realizes his landlord activities have been exposed to his followers and the media. Several activists immediately step away from him, their expressions showing the disgust of people who've discovered they've been manipulated by someone whose actions directly contradict his stated values. That's taken out of context, Dylan stammers. His camera is still rolling, but his usual confidence completely shattered. Those properties they're investments that fund the movement. Father Michael's response cuts through the excuse with surgical precision. Mr. Reed, you're charging tourists $200 per night for apartments that could house working families. You're profiting from the same short-term rental market that's displacing long-time residents. You're not funding the movement. You're funding your lifestyle with a housing crisis. The priest continues his methodical destruction of the coalition's credibility, each revelation more damaging than the last. Emma Martinez charges her followers $50 per month for organizational support, while using our church's community center for free. She's collected over $15,000 in membership fees, while taking advantage of our generosity and giving nothing back to the community she claims to serve. The financial exploitation of coalition members creates immediate anger among the remaining protesters. Many had paid the monthly fees believing they were supporting housing advocacy, not realizing they were funding Emma's comfortable lifestyle. The revelation that she's been profiting from activism while using free church facilities exposes the fundamental hypocrisy of her leadership. Father Michael's most devastating revelation comes when he produces a recording device and plays audio from a conversation between Emma and Dylan from the previous week. The conversation was captured by the church's security system when they met in the community center, discussing their strategy for the Morrison Street protest. The old lady's funeral is actually perfect timing. Emma's voice says clearly through the small speaker, the media attention will be huge. We can frame it as the establishment trying to silence us with emotional manipulation. It's exactly the kind of conflict that goes viral. Dylan's response is equally damning. Exactly. Death happens, but our cause is about the living. If we let every funeral delay our activism, we'd never get anything done. Besides, the contrast will make great content, us fighting for justice while they try to gild us with a dead person. The recording reveals that the coalition's leadership knew about Catherine's funeral and deliberately chose to block it for the media attention. They weren't ignorant of the conflict. They were exploiting it for their own gain, treating an elderly woman's death as a publicity opportunity. The remaining protesters react with shock and disgust. Many had genuinely believed they were fighting for housing justice, not realizing they were being manipulated by leaders who saw Catherine Walsh's death as a chance to generate viral content. The revelation that Emma and Dylan planned to use the funeral for media attention exposes the depth of their callousness. Within minutes, the coalition's remaining support evaporates completely. Protesters begin removing their signs and walking away, unwilling to be associated with such cynical exploitation. The street that was packed with hundreds of demonstrators now contains only Emma Martinez, Dylan Reed, and perhaps a half-dozen diehard supporters who seem unable to process the moral implications of their leaders' actions. Father Michael has achieved his goal without raising his voice or making threats. He's simply exposed the truth about the coalition's leadership and let the community draw its own conclusions. The contrast between Catherine Walsh's quiet service and the activist's self-serving exploitation has become impossible to ignore. The media crews capture the coalition's collapse in real time, their cameras recording the moment when performative activism is stripped of its pretenses and revealed for what it really is: privileged young people using other people's suffering to build their personal brands. Emma Martinez makes one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation, her voice breaking as she realizes the magnitude of her public humiliation. "This is exactly what the establishment wants," she says through her megaphone, tears streaming down her face. "They want to destroy us by focusing on individual cases instead of systemic change." Her words ring hollow against the weight of the evidence Father Michael has presented. The mourners surrounding her aren't representatives of the establishment. They're working families whose lives were directly improved by Catherine Walsh's service. The real systemic change happened through Catherine's quiet work, not through the coalition's performative protests. Dylan Reed's response reveals the fundamental selfishness that has driven his activism from the beginning. "We can't let personal attacks distract us from our mission," he says, his camera still rolling despite his obvious distress. "Catherine Walsh is dead. Our cause is about the living. We have to stay focused on what matters." The cruelty of his words, delivered while standing in front of Catherine's funeral procession, provides the perfect summary of everything wrong with performative activism. He's literally standing in the way of burying someone who actually helped people, while claiming his cause is more important than her dignity. Father Michael watches the final collapse of the coalition's credibility with quiet satisfaction. He's honored Catherine Walsh's memory by exposing the difference between authentic service and performative activism, teaching a lesson that will resonate far beyond Morrison Street. With their support gone and their credibility destroyed, Emma Martinez and Dylan Reed face the most difficult choice of their activist careers. They can continue blocking the funeral procession and face complete social ostracism, or they can step aside and admit their catastrophic error in judgment. The weight of community condemnation, media scrutiny, and their own followers' disgust has created a moment of reckoning that will define their futures. Emma makes one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, her voice breaking as she realizes the magnitude of her public humiliation. "This is exactly what the establishment wants," she says in her megaphone, tears streaming down her face. "They want to divide us by making us choose between honoring the dead and fighting for the living. We can't let emotional manipulation stop us from pursuing justice." Her words fall flat against the weight of concrete testimony about Catherine's service. The mourners surrounding her aren't representatives of the establishment. They're working families, immigrants, union members, and community volunteers who benefited directly from Catherine's help. The real establishment she should be fighting is the system of performative activism that allows privileged young people to profit from other people's suffering. Dylan Reed's response reveals the fundamental selfishness that has driven his activism from the beginning. "We can't let personal attacks distract us from our mission," he says, his camera still rolling despite his obvious distress. "Catherine Walsh is dead. Our cause is about the living. We have to stay focused on what matters." The cruelty of his words, delivered while standing in front of Catherine's funeral procession, provides the perfect summary of everything wrong with performative activism. He's literally standing in the way of burying someone who actually helped people, while claiming his cause is more important than her dignity. Father Michael steps forward, his patience finally exhausted after watching the coalition's leadership double down on their callousness. "Mr. Reed, Mississippi Martinez, you've had your moment. You've made your point. Now it's time for you to make a choice that will define who you really are." The priest's voice carries the moral authority of 18 years serving the community, of growing up in a family that understood the difference between fighting for justice and fighting for attention. You can continue blocking this funeral and prove to everyone that your activism is about your own egos, not about helping people. Or you can step aside and let us bury a woman who spent her life actually fighting for the things you only talk about. The silence that follows is deafening. The entire street holds its breath as the coalition's leaders face the consequences of their actions. Emma Martinez looks around at the faces surrounding her. The mourners who knew Catherine personally, the media crews recording her humiliation, the former supporters who've abandoned her cause. Emma breaks first under the weight of community judgment and her own recognition of moral failure. The combination of public humiliation, media scrutiny, and the revelation of her exploitation of coalition members becomes too much to bear. Without a word, she steps down from her platform and walks away, abandoning her followers and her cause in the most public way possible. Her departure creates a moment of shock among the remaining protesters. Their leader, who had been lecturing them about commitment and revolutionary steadfastness, has simply walked away when faced with the consequences of her actions. The abandonment reveals the hollow nature of her leadership and her commitment to the cause she claimed to champion. Dylan Reed, however, doubles down on his position with the stubborn certainty of someone who's never been held accountable for his actions. "I won't be intimidated by emotional manipulation," he declares to his camera, his trust fund background evident in his ability to remain defiant despite universal condemnation. Housing justice is more important than one person's funeral. This is exactly the kind of pressure that breaks down every social movement. His words are met with a chorus of boos and jeers from the crowd. Even his most devoted supporters finally abandon him, unable to justify such heartless rhetoric in the face of genuine grief and community condemnation. The young professionals who treated his activism like entertainment realize they're now associated with preventing an elderly woman's burial. Standing alone in the middle of Morrison Street, Dylan Reed finally confronts the reality of his situation. He's not a social justice warrior or a revolutionary activist. He's a privileged trust fund kid who turned activism into a hobby and other people's suffering into content for his social media accounts. The community he claimed to serve has rejected him completely, and his own followers have abandoned him in disgust. The police arrive, but they're not there to arrest protesters or clear the street by force. They're there to escort the funeral procession through the now clear intersection. Officer Maria Santos, whose family Catherine Walsh helped with citizenship papers years earlier, personally ensures the procession's safe passage through the area. "Mrs. Walsh helped my mother become a citizen," Officer Santos explains to the media crews. "She spent hours helping her study for the citizenship test, never asked for anything in return. It's an honor to make sure she gets to rest in peace beside her husband." As the funeral procession finally moves towards St. Mary's Cemetery, the community members who stood up to the coalition walk alongside the hearse. Union members, immigrant families, civil rights veterans, and religious leaders all united in their respect for Catherine Walsh and their disgust at the coalition's actions. Father Michael rides in the lead car, watching the community come together in defense of dignity and respect. The confrontation has revealed the true character of everyone involved. The coalition's leadership exposed as self-serving manipulators, the community united in support of authentic service over performative protest. The street that had been blocked for hours by activists claiming to fight for justice is now clear, allowing Catherine Walsh to complete her final journey to rest beside her husband. The funeral procession moves slowly through the intersection, past the abandoned protest signs and scattered debris of the coalition's collapsed demonstration. The lesson is clear to everyone who witnessed the confrontation. Real activism isn't about making noise or generating media attention. It's about helping people, serving communities, and making a difference in individual lives through daily acts of service and compassion. 3 months after Catherine Walsh's funeral, the ripple effects of the coalition's downfall continue to reshape Portland's activist landscape. The incident has become a case study in what happens when social justice becomes divorced from the communities it claims to serve. Emma Martinez withdrew from Columbia University and disappeared from social media entirely, unable to cope with the public humiliation and academic consequences of her actions. Her thesis advisor used the incident as a teaching moment about the dangers of treating social justice as an academic exercise rather than lived experience. Dylan Reed faced even more severe consequences. His trust fund was frozen by family members horrified by the negative publicity, and his properties were sold to help establish a housing fund for low-income families. Exactly the kind of poetic justice his grandfather's timber money deserved. He left Portland quietly, reportedly working at a family friend's business in Montana, far from the activist scene he'd tried to dominate. The Portland Justice Coalition disbanded completely, but its collapse gave birth to something more authentic. The community members who stood up to the coalition, the union workers, immigrant families, and civil rights veterans, formed the Catherine Walsh Community Action Network, an organization focused on direct service rather than performative protest. The new organization operates out of St. Catherine's Community Center, but with a different approach. Instead of charging membership fees, they pool resources to provide direct assistance to families in need. Instead of staging protests for media attention, they work quietly to address housing issues, immigration problems, and employment challenges. Father Michael serves on the organization's advisory board, along with Rosa Delgado, Tom Washington, and Dr. Miguel Vasquez. Their meetings focus on practical solutions rather than ideological purity, and their success is measured in families helped rather than followers gained. The housing development that the coalition protested was eventually built, but with modifications that addressed legitimate community concerns. The Catherine Walsh Community Action Network worked with developers to include affordable units and community space, achieving more through negotiation than the coalition ever accomplished through confrontation. The incident also sparked broader conversations about the nature of modern activism. Academic institutions began incorporating lessons about community accountability into their social justice curricula. Social media platforms started highlighting the difference between performative activism and genuine community work. Most importantly, Catherine Walsh's legacy was preserved and celebrated. The citizenship classes she taught for decades were renamed the Catherine Walsh Citizenship Center. The scholarship fund she quietly maintained was expanded with donations from people who learned about her work through the funeral incident. St. Mary's Cemetery, where Catherine was finally laid to rest beside her husband Patrick, became a site of pilgrimage for activists wanting to understand what real social justice looks like. Her simple headstone reads, "Catherine Walsh, she helped people," a stark contrast to the verbose mission statements and #activism that characterizes modern social justice movements. The annual Catherine Walsh Memorial Service, held each year on the anniversary of her funeral, brings together the diverse communities she served. The service is intentionally simple. No speeches, no protests, no media attention. Just people gathering to remember a woman who spent her life helping others without seeking recognition. Father Michael often reflects on the lessons learned from the confrontation. Catherine taught us that real activism isn't about making yourself feel important, he says in his annual memorial homily. It's about making other people's lives better. It's not about the noise you make. It's about the difference you make. The incident has become a touchstone for authentic community organizing. When new activist groups form in Portland, they're often reminded of the Catherine Walsh funeral and asked to consider whether their actions serve the community or just their own need for attention. The street where the confrontation occurred was officially renamed Catherine Walsh Way, with a small plaque noting her contributions to civil rights and immigrant services. The inscription reads, "In honor of Catherine Walsh, who understood that justice is not a performance but a practice." Dylan Reed's former live stream of the incident has been preserved as an educational tool, showing how quickly performative activism can become genuine harm. Comments on the video continue to pour in from viewers around the world, many sharing their own stories of community members like Catherine Walsh who work quietly to make the world better. The most fitting memorial to Catherine Walsh, however, is the continued work of the people she helped. The immigrants she assisted with citizenship papers now help other families navigate the system. The children she put through college have become teachers, doctors, and social workers who carry forward her ethic of service. Father Michael keeps Catherine's picture on his desk, next to one of his father from his union organizing days. Both images remind him that real change comes from people who do the work rather than those who talk about it. The Portland Justice Coalition wanted to be remembered as revolutionary activists who fought for justice. Instead, they're remembered as cautionary examples of what happens when ego overtakes empathy and performance replaces purpose. Catherine Walsh never wanted to be remembered as an activist at all. She just wanted to help people. In the end, that's exactly what made her a true revolutionary. Someone who changed the world not through speeches or protests, but through daily acts of kindness and service. As Father Michael often tells visitors to St. Catherine's, the loudest voices aren't always the most important ones. Sometimes the people who change the world are the ones who never need a megaphone. The funeral that the coalition tried to block became a celebration of authentic activism and community service. Catherine Walsh's final lesson was the same as all her others. Real justice isn't about making yourself heard. It's about making sure others are helped.